The Time Machine is a science fiction novel by H.G. Wells, published in 1895. Wells is generally credited with the popularization of the concept of time travel by using a vehicle that allows an operator to travel purposely and selectively forwards or backwards in time. The term time machine, coined by Wells, is now almost universally used to refer to such a vehicle. The Time Machine has since been adapted into 3 feature films of the same name, as well as 2 television versions, and a large number of comic book adaptations. It has also indirectly inspired many more works of fiction in many media history. Wells had considered the notion of time travel before in a short story titled The Chronic Argonauts. This work, published in his college newspaper, was the foundation for the Time Machine. Wells frequently stated that he had thought of using some of this material in a series of articles in the Pall Mall Gazette, until the publisher asked him if he could instead write a serial novel on the same theme. Wells readily agreed and was paid £100 on its publication by Heinemann in 1895, which first published the story in serial form in the January to May numbers of the New Review. Henry Holt and Company published the first book edition on the 7th of May 1895. Heinemann published an English edition on the 29th of May. These 2 editions are different textually and are commonly referred to as the Holt text and Heinemann text, respectively. Nearly all modern reprints reproduce the Heinemann text. The story reflects Wells' own socialist political views, his view on life and abundance, and the contemporary angst about industrial relations. It is also influenced by Ray Lancaster's theories about social degeneration and shares many elements with Edward Bulwer Lytton's novel Viril, The Power of the Coming Race. Other science fiction works of the period, including Edward Bellamy's novel Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, and the later film Metropolis, dealt with similar themes. This work is an early example of the Dying Earth subgenre, the portion of the novella that sees the time traveler in a distant future where the sun is huge and red also places the time machine within the realm of eschatology, i.e., the study of the end times, the end of the world, and the ultimate destiny of humankind. Plot: the book's protagonist is an English scientist and gentleman inventor living in Richmond, Surrey, in Victorian England, and identified by a narrator simply as the time traveler. The narrator recounts the traveler's lecture to his weekly dinner guests that time is simply a 4th dimension, and his demonstration of a tabletop model machine for traveling through it. He reveals that he has built a machine capable of carrying a person through time, and returns at dinner the following week to recount a remarkable tale, becoming the new narrator. In the new narrative, the time traveler tests his device with a journey that takes him to A.D. 800 and 2701, where he meets the Boy society of small, elegant, childlike adults. They live in small communities within large and futuristic yet slowly deteriorating buildings, doing no work and having a frugivorous diet. His efforts to communicate with them are hampered by the lack of curiosity or discipline, and he speculates that they are a peaceful, communist society, the result of humanity conquering nature with technology, and subsequently evolving to adapt to an environment in which strength and intellect are no longer advantageous to survival. Returning to the site where he arrived, the time traveler is shocked to find his time machine missing, and eventually concludes that it has been dragged by some unknown party into a nearby structure with heavy doors, locked from the inside, which resembles a sphinx. Luckily, he had removed the machine's levers before leaving it. Later in the dark, he is approached menacingly by the Morlocks, ape-like troglodytes who live in darkness underground and surface only at night. Within the dwellings he discovers the machinery and industry that makes the above-ground paradise possible. He alters his theory, speculating that the human race has evolved into two species. The leisured classes have become the ineffectual Eloi, and the downtrodden working classes have become the brutal, light-fearing Morlocks. Deducing that the Morlocks have taken his time machine, he explores the Morlock tunnels, learning that due to a lack of any other means of sustenance, they feed on the Eloi. His revised analysis is that the relationship is not one of lords and servants, but of livestock and ranchers. The time traveler theorizes that intelligence is the result of and response to danger, with no real challenges facing the Eloi. They have lost the spirit, intelligence, and physical fitness of humanity at its peak. Meanwhile, he saves an Eloi named Weena from drowning as none of the other Eloi take any notice of her plight, and they develop an innocently affectionate relationship over the course of several days. He takes Weena with him on an expedition to a distant structure that turns out to be the remains of a museum, where he finds a fresh supply of matches and fashions a crude weapon against Morlocks, whom he must fight to get back his machine. He plans to take Weena back to his own time, because the long and tiring journey back to Weena's home is too much for them. They stop in the forest, and they're then overcome by Morlocks in the night, and Weena faints. The traveler escapes when a small fire he had left behind them to distract the Morlocks catches up to them as a forest fire. Weena and the pursuing Morlocks are lost in the fire, and the time traveler is devastated over his loss. The Morlocks open the Sphinx and use the time machine as bait to capture the traveler, not understanding that he will use it to escape. He reattaches the levers before he travels further ahead to roughly 30 million years from his own time. There he sees some of the last living things on a dying Earth. Menacing reddish crab-like creatures slowly wandering the blood-red beaches, chasing enormous butterflies in a world covered in simple lichenous vegetation. He continues to make short jumps through time, seeing Earth's rotation gradually cease and the sun grow larger, redder, and dimmer, and the world falling silent and freezing as the last degenerate living things die out. Overwhelmed, he goes back to the machine and returns to Victorian time, arriving at his laboratory just 3 hours after he originally left. Interrupting dinner, he relates his adventures to his disbelieving visitors, producing as evidence 2 strange white flowers Weena had put in his pocket. The original narrator then takes over and relates that he returned to the time traveler's house the next day, finding him preparing for another journey. After promising to return in a short period of time, the narrator reveals that after 3 years of waiting, the time traveler has never returned. Deleted text. A section from the 11th chapter of the serial published in New Review was deleted from the book. It was drafted at the suggestion of Wells' editor, William Ernest Henley, who wanted Wells to oblige your editor by lengthening the text with, among other things, an illustration of the ultimate degeneracy of humanity. There was a slight struggle, Wells later recalled, between the writer and W. E. Henley, who wanted, he said, to put a little writing into the tale, but the writer was in reaction from that sort of thing. The Henley interpolations were cut out again, and he had his own way with his text. Quote, "This portion of the story was published elsewhere as The Gray Man." The deleted text was also published by Forrest J. Ackerman in an issue of the American edition of Perry Rhodan. The deleted text recounts an incident immediately after the traveler's escape from the Morlocks. He finds himself in the distant future of an unrecognizable Earth, populated with furry, hopping herbivores resembling kangaroos. He stuns a kills one with a rock, and upon closer examination realizes they are probably the descendants of humans. Morlocks. A gigantic centipede-like arthropod approaches and the traveler flees into the next day, finding that the creature has apparently eaten the tiny humanoid. The Dover Press and Eastern Press editions of the novella restore this deleted segment. Scholarship. Significant scholarly commentary on the time machine began from the early 1960s, initially contained in various broad studies of Wells' early novels and studies of utopias, dystopias in science fiction. Much critical and textual work was done in the 1970s, including the tracing of the very complex publication history of the text, its drafts and unpublished fragments. A further resurgence in scholarship came around the time of the novella centenary in 1995, and a major outcome of this was the 1995 conference and substantial anthology of academic papers, which is collected in print as H.G. Wells' perennial time machine, selected essays from the centenary conference, the time machine, past, present, and future. This publication then allowed the development of a study guidebook, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, a reference guide. The scholarly journal The Wellsian has published around 20 articles on the time machine, and the new U.S. academic journal devoted to H.G. Wells, The Undying Fire, has published 3 since its inception in 2002. The name Eloi is the Hebrew plural for Elohim, or lesser gods. In the Old Testament, the name Morlock may be a play on Molochs, what a miner might call themselves, or a Scots word for rubbish, or a reference to the Morlacki community in Dalmatia. Symbols. The Time Machine can be read as a symbolic novel. There are several symbols, including the Sphinx, flowers, and fire. The time machine itself can also be viewed as a symbol. The Sphinx appeared on the cover of the first London edition as requested by Wells and would have been familiar to his readers. The statue of the Sphinx is the place where the Morlocks hide the time machine and references the Sphinx in the story of Oedipus, who gives a riddle that he must first solve before he can pass. The white flowers can symbolize Wiener's devotion and innocence and contrast with the machinery of the time machine. They are the only proof that the time traveler's story is true. Fire symbolizes civilization, as the time traveler uses it to ward off the Morlocks, but it escapes his control and turns into a forest fire. The time traveler. Although the time traveler's real name is never given in the original novella, other sources have named him. One popular theory, encouraged by movies like Time After Time and certain episodes of the television show Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, is that the time traveler is meant to be H.G. Wells himself. Indeed, in the George Pal movie adaptation of The Time Machine, his name is given as George, which was H.G. Wells' middle name. Manufactured by H. George Wells, can be seen in every close-up of the time machine control panel in the film. H.G. Wells' great-grandson, Simon Wells, directed a 2002 remake where the time traveler's name is Alexander Hart Dagon. In The Time Ships, Stephen Baxter's sequel to The Time Machine, the time traveler encounters his younger self via time travel. His younger self reacts with embarrassment to his older self's knowledge of his real names. I held up my hand. I had an inspiration. No, I will use, if you will permit, Moses. He took a deep pull on his brandy, and gazed at me with genuine anger in his grey eyes. How do you know about that? Moses, my hated first name, for which I had been endlessly tormented at school, and which I had kept a secret since leaving home. Quote, this is a reference to H.G. Wells' story, The Chronic Argonauts, the story which grew into The Time Machine, in which the inventor of the time machine is named Dry. Moses Nebogipfel, the surname of Wells' first inventor, graces another character in Baxter's book. Doc Savage. His Apocalyptic Life by Philip Jose Farmer gives the time traveler's name as Bruce Clark Wildman. The Rook comic book series gives the time traveler's name as Adam Dane. In the Doctor Who comic strip story, The Eternal Present, the character of Theophilus Tolliver is implied to be the time traveler of Wells' novella. Also featured in Doctor Who is Wells himself, appearing in the television serial Time Lash. The events of this story are portrayed as having inspired Wells to write The Time Machine. In Episode 11, Season 1, of U.S. television series Legends of Tomorrow, the team travels back in time to the Old West in hopes to hide from the Time Masters. During the stay there, the character Martin Stein saves a boy's life with modern medicine. After a fighting scene that reveals the whole team to be from the future, Martin Stein learns that the name of the boy he saved is Herbert George Wells. "You're H.G. Wells?" he asks him. The boy replies, "H.G. Wells. I like that name," implying that they inspired the stories that he read and also the name he goes by. The Hartford manuscript by Richard Cowper names the time traveler as Dr. Robert James Pensley, born to James and Martha Pensley in 1850 and disappearing without trace on the 18th of June 1894, and who was part of the same social and political circle as Wells, in particular, the Fabian Society. The ICE role-playing game supplement Time Riders suggests that the time traveler's name is Ashley Holmes. It suggests that the time traveler is actually a woman who disguised herself as a man during the male chauvinistic Victorian era. She is said to be the sister of Sherlock Holmes. It has also been suggested that the time traveler was based on Thomas Edison.